Welcome to another episode of the Two World Podcast. My name is Jacob Dodson. I'm one of the co-hosts, and I have with me today my other co-host who is...
I am Barney.
And we're delighted today to have a guest that we've been anticipating and wanting to have on our show for a long time, and his name is...
Michael Ludwig.
And we reached out to Michael recently. I had noticed on Facebook he had posted some pictures from a recent return visit to Niger, and it got me thinking, it would be so interesting to hear his story about his time in Niger, serving with local missions agencies there and with his family, and then also to hear a little bit about his transition back to life here in the US. And in the midst of all of that, a return visit back to reconnect with people in Niger. So I thought it could be an interesting story today to help us see through another person's lens about those types of big transitions. And just to give a little bit more background information, Michael is a friend of mine from the college days. We both went to the College of Worcester, and it's been wonderful to stay connected over the years. Before Michael went into missions, back in those days, he studied archaeology and was into classical studies. And so it's been interesting to see his own journey develop over time. And so as we're getting started today, I couldn't help but notice, Michael, when you posted some of your recent pictures from your visit, you made some references to the Indiana Jones movies. And I think you were saying, seeing some of these historic sites, like I think you went to a very old mosque or something like that. It brought back memories of the adventurous feel of like Indiana Jones movies. And of maybe, is that part of the reason why back in the day you had studied archaeology, that had drawn you in, that captured your imagination? Or
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I think in some ways, Indiana Jones had something to do with it, and the feeling of excitement of searching for things. I think for me, it was more going to ancient places and kind of imagining what people might be like and wanting to know, and the mystery of, getting to imagine what people were like and what they were thinking and what their beliefs were. That drew me into archaeology, but then with archaeology, you figure you're going to be out in the middle of the boonies somewhere, camping and digging for things. And so in many ways, when people have, talked about, well, you did archaeology and then you became a pastor and a missionary, I'm like, yeah, well, actually, I spent a lot of time out in the desert learning about culture and traveling around. And so there are a lot of similarities to what you might think an archaeologist is going to do. So yeah, that was some of my observations, especially from this trip, because Niger is mostly desert country, but most of the people live along the southern border. So I'm going to share my screen here and put up the map of Niger. So the satellite view, you can see, yeah, it's mostly desert, but most people live along the southern border here, where it's kind of like the shore of the desert, where you can raise some crops. And Nigeria, as you can see, is very green. And so some of that, the same agriculture stretches up here. So, but on this trip, I had the chance to go way up to Agadez, which is more in the middle of the country. And that's the desert proper. And so just the feeling of, yeah, you're out in the middle of nowhere, and there's lots of trading and smuggling and things that go on in that city. And so riding around on the back of a motorcycle and feeling like you're out in the Wild West did give me, that's kind of what was the Indiana Jones feeling. And I want to show you a picture of the mosque. Here's the famous mosque from Agadez, which is all made of mud, brick, and wood, and hundreds of years old. So that was quite an experience to climb to the top of that. And there's bats that live all the way through it. And so you have to hunch down through a small passageway and climb up these stairs while bats are like streaming past you.
wow.
And they said it was 199 steps. I didn't count because I was a little more thinking about all the the bat poop that I was walking on with my bare feet, and all the diseases that
Oh,
people get from close contact with bats. And but when I got to the top, it was worth it. I was really pleased. And I had one other picture from that trip up to Agadez, which some things that surprised me. I lived in Niger for 8 years in a different region and never knew some things like this. This was a picture of a bakery that was built more than 100 years ago. And it just has amazing kind of mud brick fresco and relief patterns and just interesting architecture and artistry that we don't get to see, at least where we're living, and in many places where the local memory isn't quite as long, or the things that people have made 100 years ago aren't surviving anymore. So it was, this latest trip did give me more of a chance to also get my history interests as well as the ministry interests in Niger. So yeah, that's kind of a long way of answering the question, but the adventure is something that I appreciate from archaeology. And the life of a missionary or someone living overseas isn't all adventure, but you definitely get the chance to do some things you wouldn't do in the United States. So that's kind of a side blessing.
yeah. As you were talking there, I just can't help but sense your admiration or appreciation of the culture and what you were seeing there as you went back this time. And I guess I kind of wondered if you might unpack a little bit more how important it is when you are living and serving in another community to take time to appreciate what's around you, um, to learn, to grow, to let it also impact you. I wonder how much of your experience there you discovered ended up being something you came away really appreciating and admiring.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that I learned from the people in Niger that, I think are important to kind of dive into culture and see how have people been formed by their culture, and how does that reflected in how they're living today. So one of the things that I love most about Niger is their proverbs. And that was a good tool for me too, to start learning the language, was to learn the proverbs. And you don't understand much at first, but there are these things that people say over and over again, and they kind of help you get words and grammar, and then also the thought process of people in your mind. And so one of the proverb that people use all the time is slowly, slowly doesn't keep you from reaching your destination. But then there's a response. The other person is supposed to say, but it does keep you from getting there at the right time. So
Mm.
this is a very deep thing in the culture, and similarities in other African cultures, that, don't be in a rush. It's okay to go slowly, because, that's part of the process. It's part of the journey, is going slowly. But then there's also a reminder, yeah, but if you go too slowly, you might miss the whole thing. You might not get there at the right time. So just, hearing those things, putting together, seeing how that has played out in the people's lives and in the daily culture, I think was a fascinating part for me, but also so important if you're, especially as a missionary, one of your big goals is to share the good news with people and be a representative of Jesus, share Jesus with your life. And Jesus spent a lot of time talking to people and asking them questions, seeing where they were before then he was able to share with them, things that got them thinking and asking questions and moving closer to him and closer to the Father. So I think that's central to the task of missionary, but it's also, obviously important anywhere you're going to live, and you want to interact with people and get to know how people are thinking and how they're acting. That question, one of the things I was thinking about when knowing about this podcast is questions of culture, and something that bothers me and gets pointed out all the time is we tend to talk about Africa as one monolithic thing. Like anytime I tell someone, oh yeah, I lived in Niger, they're like, oh yeah, I had a friend who went over there to Africa. I forget whatever, like they say, like, oh yeah, over there. Like it's all one place. I forget where they went, but they went to that place, that African place. And so I know we tend to, I don't know, you may experience this with Asia too, Barney, but there's a simplification of, oh yeah, that's African. That's how people do it in Africa, where it's like, there's a lot of different countries in Africa. There's a lot of different cultures. So we can't, paint with such a broad brush, although there's lots of similarities about the community aspects. But that's one thing I want us to think about. And I'm constantly thinking about when I'm saying, oh yeah, Africans do this or Africans do that. Well, yeah, there's a lot of different types of Africans. So be careful.
Yeah, that's a really good word. Yeah, and before we ask any further questions, had you finished sharing your screen? Were there any other pictures, or was that it? Because if so, you can feel free to.
I'm sorry
stop.
about that.
Oh no, it's totally fine.
I'll stop sharing unless.
No, I'm glad that you were sharing. I just wanted to make sure people could see the fuller view of your face while you're talking instead of the small little icon.
I'm glad you have experience with this sort of thing. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I'm really glad for the things that you brought up. There's several threads I want to follow up on, but I want to give Barney a chance if he has a question at this point.
Yeah, I actually, maybe myself for sure, and maybe some of our listeners are very interested in the little tidbits of the journey of how that you've been on and how this all got started. But I'm curious, thinking of my own experience when I was getting ready to join Mennonite Central Committee and volunteer with them. I knew of some of the places where I might go, and I had places that I hoped to go, but I knew that in the end, the decision was up to them. How was it in your case? Did you have Niger on your radar at all, or did you have to were you able to give some input of where you wanted to end up going, or how was it that you ended?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm a pastor in the PCUSA, Presbyterian Church USA. And so that's the agency that sent us to Niger. And we had been thinking about mission work for a long time and being involved in mission work. And so for us, it happened that there was a position posted for Niger. And we had been thinking about, what type of situation we are gifted for. And this started to kind of line up. Although before seeing this position, when we saw this position, Niger, Africa, kind of had to say, okay, where is that? Let me look on a map and make sure that I know what I'm talking about here. So we didn't really know anything about Niger specifically. And Niger is the French pronunciation, which we prefer because it's a French-speaking country. But so had to learn about it and learn this is a place that's ranked last on the UN Human Development Index almost every year. And so very low development, very low education. The literacy rate is one of the least in the world. And so those were some of the factors that said, you have gifts for teaching, working with youth, working with pastors, and that's the type of position. So we didn't really know any of the places in Niger or say, oh, I want to go to that mosque in Agadez. It was more just, okay, this is a country, we're going to learn about it, we're going to learn about the people. And one thing that I appreciated about the PCUSA is they have been changing the way that they do mission over the last couple decades. But one of the big focuses is not calling people missionaries with the negative connotations that have come from the colonial past, but to call people mission co-workers, and to try to emphasize that we are in these countries at the request of partners. So we always work with a partner church that's already been established. Some of them were established by Presbyterian missionaries hundreds of years ago, but in our case, it was just a general Christian church, the largest church in the country, and they were looking for people who could come help them with training pastors. And so putting the focus on the ball is in our partner's court, they're inviting us. They know a lot more than we do about ministry in their context. And so whatever we can do to follow the partner's lead. And so that was a big emphasis from the beginning, which I think is a helpful corrective for so much of the mission work in our past, and even our current culture, which kind of glorifies mission work as, okay, we're going to go and we're going to build schools or whatever for these people who don't have or can't do it. And when in reality, there's already a lot of people working on the ground on these type of things. God is already moving in these places. The Christian church is already, mobilized. And in a lot of cases, it's simply people needing a little extra help or partnership to encourage. And so another fascinating part about Niger is it's a 99% Muslim country, but it's also freedom of religion. So the Christian church is allowed to operate, and oftentimes it's invited. The church is invited to send people somewhere because there's the hope that, they'll bring schools, they'll bring other benefits with them. And so my work has mostly been learning about what these evangelists do when they go out to a totally new place, and what kind of training and resources can we help them to have in order to start relationships, in order to share wisdom with the community that they can start to pick up and say, this is a person that we should listen to. And they're talking about physical things, they're talking about spiritual things. What's this all about? So that's kind of the framework that we come out of not knowing Niger beforehand, but knowing we're going to go to this place, we're going to be learners and learn from the partner church, and then see how can we help them, continue this ministry.
As you were talking there about partnership, I really like that posture, but it also made me think too of maybe how partnership is functioning in your experience on a different level with your spouse, because Michael's wife Rachel had experience abroad, and was it Guatemala? Is that where she had been for a time? And I remember her also when we were in college talking about, she seemed to be very aware of global missions with the New Wilmington, was it missions conference? Her family was very invested in that ministry. And so I felt like when I first heard that you were going, I felt like, Michael has a good partner in Rachel, because she has an imagination or a vision for going to another culture, encountering the people, learning, engaging, and it wouldn't be for her something that would be pushing her outside of a place she'd want to go, but she could. Did you feel like you as a couple, it really helped that you both kind of had that interest, that it was very much ended up being that way, like a deep partnership?
Yeah, I think that was pretty central in our sense of call to mission. Was we have lived in other places. Rachel had really deep experience of living with a family in Guatemala and learning the culture and trying to be together with them as much as possible. And so we felt like this is something we can do. This is something we're excited to try and work out how it works for our family. So one thing that she discovered and we discovered together is it's a lot more difficult to integrate into a new culture as a family than it is as a single person. In some ways, I think it's more difficult to be isolated and alone as a single person. And there's a lot of things that go along with that, but there's also a lot more freedom to be welcomed into someone else's family or to be pulled into social situations where you're free to yeah, say I'm going to spend 5 hours sitting with these people out wherever at a cafe or under the tree. Whereas when you have a family, well, I need to go home and help with my family. I have other time constraints, other even safety issues. But knowing that Rachel had this, had experience in mission, had a deep, passion and education in mission throughout her growing up, I think that was a big thing that helped us say, yeah, this is what our gifts and, our life has been pushing us to. This is what God's call is for us. And so I think that helped us, especially in the initial years of kind of already giving us a pattern of what to do to try to learn another culture and get into it. But as I was saying, it's also more difficult when you're a couple, when you're a family. You get different kinds of invitations and you have different kinds of time frame. And so that makes being immersed in the culture a little more difficult.
You use the phrase there about being welcomed into the family. As Rachel thought about her experience of being welcomed into a family in Guatemala, and then the idea of moving to Niger and the idea of being welcomed, it also made me think of your own family and welcoming people into your own family. And I wondered if you would be willing to share a little bit about your journey with adopting two children from Niger, and what that experience has been like for you. And as you're talking about being welcoming there, that whole vision for enlarging your family, and just wondered if you would share a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's another big element, because family ties are pretty deep, right? And so that's a pretty deep thing. But throughout our process, even before we went to Niger, we were doing fostering and we were thinking about adoption, and just committed to the idea of there are lots of kids out there who don't have families, and what can we do to help provide something lasting and that deep connection for some kids who don't have it. So then when we were in Niger and got to know kind of the situation and learned about where there were some Christian orphanages, then we explored more the process of adoption. And there were two boys. There was a boy who was 4 years old, and so we ended up being able to welcome him in, and a long process with the courts there and things. And then we thought, oh, that's our only opportunity. There weren't other opportunities. And then suddenly, right when we were telling our ministry partners, you can stop this looking because there's obviously the doors are closed. Suddenly there was an infant that was taken to a Christian orphanage because the government orphanage was too full. And they said, you need to find somebody to adopt them right away. And so that process, opened up for us again. And I think it's been a good process. We feel very blessed to be able to adopt kids, and that I think has also communicated to people that we lived around, we're willing to welcome people from your culture into our family. And so I think that showed an openness, but it's also there's interesting dynamics with adoption, because in their culture, they don't even have a word for adoption. So I was looking into this as we're looking at scripture passages that talked about us being adopted along with brothers and sisters of Christ. It's a little bit difficult to explain because they just say, you took this child. It's kind of the same of, okay, you took on a child. And so it's more common in their culture for relatives, if parents die or they have issues, they can't take care of their kids, it goes to the closest relative, or it goes to a more distant relative, or it goes to a neighbor child. And so it's a little bit strange, the idea of orphanages, or the idea that you would adopt someone who's from a totally different family or totally different place. And so I think there's there are some negative issues of that, of people understanding, is it just because, what are you going to do with this child? Like, why do you want this child? Because another issue is children are valuable for farming and valuable for working in the home. And so even in the Christian orphanages that are in the country, kids will be sent there for maybe 5 or 6 years. And then when they get to a more working age, some relative in the family is able to bring them back into some household. And so it's kind of like, well, are the orphanages really necessary? Is adoption really necessary if there are ways for kids to be brought back into a family group? And then you have issues of, is that best for the kid? Is it better for them to be adopted by somebody from some other culture and have all those issues? Is it better for them to go back to a relative where they might be treated kind of as a second-class citizen or child who does most of the work, but still they're part of their people, they know where they came from, they're in their culture. So we've wrestled with a lot of those issues of culture and of well-being, but I think from our perspective, it's clear that being in a Christian household, being raised to know God personally, has huge benefits. And then there's other, hopeful benefits that we're able to help our adopted kids with as well. But that's another big issue in mission, as I've been reading a really thought-provoking book that's been highlighting some of the things we do in mission that are really detrimental and counterproductive, like food packing for situations that aren't emergencies, creates a system of dependence. And orphanages in many countries around the world, we've gotten rid of orphanages in the United States and Europe because we've found that there are better ways to care for kids, but we're still perpetuating a system of orphanages in other places around the world where it's probably not so healthy. And sponsoring children, there's good things about sponsoring and providing for a child, but there's also a lot of false things that you're setting up for why are these children selected rather than these children? Why does that kid get a present for his birthday and I don't? Or just the idea of there's somebody out there who's going to give you free things if you can get in the right, your name on the right list and talk to the right people. And so just thinking about that, there are issues with orphanages and adoptions that are dangerous. But I think for us living in the country and being able to see the system and the people that we are working with from the orphanage help to allay some of those fears about perpetuating a negative system as well. I'm sorry, that's a really long answer, but those are my thoughts when you start talking about adoption.
No, I loved your answer. It was very nuanced, and it kind of laid out some of the major challenges that you face in adopting children from another country, but it also, I think, identifies maybe some of your heart or your passion that what you would do would be, you would do it well and for the right reasons. I know what we interviewed John Longacre towards the beginning of our podcast last year about his and Julie's journey of adoption for Jonathan and Isaac from China. And they said that one of the things that was very important for them is that they would be stewards almost of the heritage and the culture of the boys that they were adopting, and try to make a way for there to be opportunities for them to stay in touch with it over the years. And so, for example, when they first came, since Julie had language experience in Chinese, she would speak with them in Chinese, but they've taken several trips back and always tried to include their boys. And is there a sense of that for you as well, that you and Rachel want to be stewards of their culture and heritage and help them find ways to stay connected as much as possible while you're living in the US?
Yeah, I think that is one of our goals. And I think that's kind of how we have decided to come back to the US, but committed to staying connected with Niger and encouraging the church there. And so it seems like there will be avenues for us to keep the boys connected to their heritage. But I also think that's it's a honorable goal, but also a very difficult one. And maybe more so in this age group where they are. One of our sons is 5 years old, the other's 10. And so in some ways, with being how young they were, they understand less about their own country than our two older kids do, because our two older kids could understand a little more of what's going on, could remember more of the visits that we have been to see different things, whereas Zach and Isaac were a little bit younger, and especially even our 10-year-old was spending so much effort in learning English and getting used to our home family and that time, that he remembers less of the local languages than our older kids do. And so in some senses, I feel like right now there's a big disconnect and it's not as meaningful for them. But I think as they get older and understand more, I think it's going to be more important. And I think they're going to be asking more questions about where did that come from, and those origin questions. So in that way, being close enough to keep them connected and have access to learning about their biological, their native culture is going to be important.
I noticed in the chat that Barney had a question, and my sense was from it that maybe he was wondering a little bit about the story of how the time frame of how long you've been reconnected in the U.S. and maybe how long it's been since you've come back, and a little bit of the timing, if you'd be willing to just talk a little bit about that transition time.
Yeah. So we spent about 8 years living in Niger, and then during the COVID time, we came back to the States. Our mission agency said, we might not be able to get you back any other time, so you better come now. And so we also had a surgery for our youngest son that was scheduled. We had to be back for. So we were back about 9 months then, and then we went back for a half a year to kind of close things up and get the relationship moving post us being there. And so then that's been about a year. We left last August, 2021, and have been in the United States about a year. And so one particularity of the pastorate that I have, I'm associate pastor in Midland, Michigan now, in a church that had been supporting us as mission co-workers. And so one of their interests was that I keep connected with the mission work and the partnership. And so they built into my position about a month every year where I could travel and do things with our partner church. And so that's been a really big blessing. But this was my first chance of going back to Niger in this August and kind of seeing the friends and ministry partners and how they're doing, and also asking lots of questions about, we have a different relationship now. How do they see a partnership working? What would they be interested in? And as I mentioned, I've been reading this book. It's called Freeing Congregational Mission. It's written by the former director of our mission agency, Hunter Farrell. And it asks a lot of insightful questions about how can we be better partners. And one of their three kind of key things that they lift up. One is a cultural humility, and that's the learner posture. Another is a theology of companionship. So more than putting the work and the task first, what does it mean for us to be together as brothers and sisters? And kind of the image of two images, one of walking together on a road. When you're walking somewhere on a road, you have a lot of time to talk about what you're doing, where you're going to go. If you want to stop here to get something to eat, if I want to stop there and talk to somebody, we have a lot of give and take, a lot of time together. And that's, I think, an ideal picture of what we want to do in Christian ministry and in Christian partnership. But oftentimes we just kind of get on the superhighway and say, we want to help this, and we're going to bring our resources to make sure this happens. And so we miss a lot of that companionship. And then the third thing, which I think is the most difficult thing, is a striving for co-development, which is idea that I worked with a lot in the kind of work that I did, was trying to help people improve health and have the pastors have ways that they could help their villages improve health. But that doesn't work when you just say, okay, do this and do this and do this, and it doesn't work in the culture. So you need to help people figure out ways to develop themselves and develop their own community, and also realize that they have gifts and ideas and wisdom that helps you from your culture develop and think of things in a different way and be a more mature Christian. So that's kind of bringing some of those ideas back to talk to our partners and see what they think. And it's been an interesting process, but another tension that we've been feeling in our church and in our church mission agency is there's this kind of impetus of we need to break down our colonial habits that are still lasting up to this point. But in many ways, we're still imposing certain ideas on our partners, saying, oh, we had these great ideas that are so much more liberating and, so much more correct. So now work with these ideas with us. And it's still us saying, well, we have the answers, now work with these answers that we found, rather than taking people where they are. And a lot of people and our partners are still kind of in the pattern of, well, you have the resources, help us with these monetary resources. And so it can also be helping people realize what gifts they have to share with us, helping people realize that we're not just expecting them to give the right answers and then we're going to release money, but they really should have the freedom to tell us what they honestly think and what they've seen from their experience will work and what won't work. And kind of so bringing more space and not just trying to say, well, now we have a new set of correct ideas that we want you to work with. So that's another thing of not going too quickly and trying to give space for conversation.
Yeah, your third point especially made me think back to a chat that we had with John Roth, a professor at Goshen College, who is now really involved with the Mennonite World Conference, and he pointed out that a majority of Mennonites are actually in Asia and Africa more than the U.S., and how it's important to give more attention to our brothers and sisters in those countries as they're kind of statistically more prevalent than we are.
Right.
I'm curious.
A lot more experience to share with us as well that we don't realize.
Yeah, right. From so many different experiences. Yeah, exactly. That fundamental kind of developing things that they've had. I'm curious. Can you point to, is anything tangible, kind of anything specific that you feel has kind of influenced you, that you've brought back from your time, that has kind of influenced you now as a pastor from that experience, that you could directly say, oh, this is for sure because of my time in Niger?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think there are a lot of more subtle things, but one of the biggest things that I think I've learned from the church in Niger is gratitude. And just every time they're praying, they're focusing a lot on gratitude. Every time there's a worship service, and I think it may be a little less common in my tradition of growing up in the Lutheran Church, of being a Presbyterian, but every worship service, the church in Niger has a time in the middle before the sermon for witnessing, or they call it giving witnessing to Thanksgiving, is basically the translation. And so people will stand up and say, I was really sick with malaria this week, but God has given me health and strength, and I'm thankful. Or I was in an accident this week, and but thank God I didn't lose any limbs and I'm okay. And some people talk about, I went to visit my parents in the village this week and my dad accepted Jesus. Or, I had this conversation with somebody and they were really, angry, but then, we talked about it and there's a spirit of peace. And so just these times when members of the church are standing up and saying, I'm thankful to God because this is how I saw God working in my life this week. And I don't know that that translates to how we could do that in our worship service, but there is a certain element of focusing on Thanksgiving. And even one of the most common responses in their language to, if somebody tells you something good, they say, thank God. And for me, that's just kind of a throwaway phrase in English when I hear people say it. But when I hear people say it in the native language of Hausa, for me, it's like, oh yeah, that's God. We need to be thanking God constantly. For all these things, almost every conversation, somebody will say, thank God. And so to kind of circle back and see that as not just cultural, like, goodbye, God bless you, when we don't think about it, but to think about that as an intentional, oh yeah, you're telling me that, thank God for that, and kind of remembering to keep a focus on gratitude each day, each week. So I think that's something that seeped into me and has changed my perspective for my time there.
Would you be willing to share those words in Hausa with us for thank God?
Godiya ga Allah.
Godiya ga Allah.
Mhm.
Wow.
So Allah is the word for God, and Godiya is a word for Thanksgiving.
Wow. Wow. That's beautiful. I'm thinking here a little bit about the image of our podcast. On our graphic, we have two worlds coming together, and in that space in between them, there's just this very thin margin. And in a lot of ways, you and your family have been living in that space in your time in Niger, like an in-between space between cultures in a way, or worlds. And I love that you've come away with a sense of gratitude, like you were just saying, a sense of slowing down, not being too rushed. You talked a little bit about identity earlier, how sometimes we might look at Africa and have a broad brushstroke. We don't see the nuance of the various cultures. You're talking about identity for your children that you've adopted, and how, as they grow up, what it will mean for them to have part of their heritage from Niger and then part of it from the US. We haven't talked much about your own children and what it's like for children to grow up in an in-between space, and what does that mean for their identity, as both American, but yet at the same time formed by another place and having a mixture, and so I kind of wonder if you might say something about like what it's like. Maybe some of our listeners haven't experienced that before, living in another culture, and if you could just describe for them like what it's like to be shaped and formed, how your identity changes, and like how you come away from an experience like that. It sounds like you've come away with gratitude, which is wonderful. Are there any other reflections you would share?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a big topic of third culture kids who kind of are mixed between two cultures, um, and how they sort things out. And it's difficult for a lot of them. I think it's easier for adult like myself to go and pick something up from the culture and say, "Oh, that's different, and how can I incorporate that into my life?" I think what we're seeing right now for our kids is they don't feel like they know what's normal in the United States. And so they feel like they're kind of have a big blank space there and like, well, I don't know what is the normal thing. I'm trying to pick that up. And so they do have a sense of what's normal in Niger and what's normal for the Muslim culture that we lived in our neighborhood, whereas how we lived in a different way from that, or how we participated in some of those things. So I think that's still going to be their struggle for a while, to figure out how do we figure out, what was normal and how we knew we were different because we were Christian. And then in the United States, we don't really know what's normal, but we're trying to pick that up. And then what does it mean to be a Christian in this post-Christendom culture, um, that we're a part of? So I think also COVID has been difficult for them because it's been harder to interact with other kids in the past 2 years that they've spent more of their time in the United States. And so that's, slowed even that process down. So I don't know what the verdict will be, but as you're saying, we acknowledge it's not an easy process, and it's something that takes time and I think it will take them having some deep friendships in the United States before they have a better handle on what their own life is going to look like as a mixture of things they've learned in Niger and things in the United States.
I'm kind of wondering if there's a connector here between some of what you're describing and maybe to some extent your experience, Barney, raising a family in Japan, but you yourself being from the US, and how obviously you see your sons being shaped by Japanese culture, but yet they have these experiences when they come visit family in the US. They're not quite as immersed, definitely, in the culture of the US. But do you see some of that at play too, in like almost an emergence of a third type of identity, or where they have a mixture of both American and Japanese sensibilities or cultural expectations? Or do you have any connectors there with what Michael's saying?
Yeah, that's a fantastic point and a good question. And I think that my children are just 6 and almost 3, and I think that my oldest son, he tends to follow my lead, and I think maybe it makes him feel a little bit. Maybe I don't know if it's if he's doing it on purpose or what, but maybe he sometimes feels a little bit outside of his culture because maybe he sees me maybe some of the things I do that don't quite fit into the puzzle pieces because I'm not exactly able to fit exactly into the culture, and so he probably wonders, why is it that Dad isn't saying this at the right time or doing this at the right time or not exactly acting like his mom or his grandparents or his friends and their parents. But I also wonder if he kind of feels, maybe I also sense that maybe he feels a little bit proud of having this third space. He tends to kind of really like that he has this thing that makes him different. And I don't know if maybe that's even kind of an American thing that he's also kind of maybe subtly picked up from me or not. But on the other hand, I see a lot of times where he, fits in very smoothly, and just things just flow perfectly, and he responds to things differently than how maybe I would have without taking time to think it through. And yeah, so he does have this kind of really unique way that he fits into both cultures at the same time. But when we were just recently visiting my family in Ohio for the 2 weeks, he didn't. I don't think that he felt anything unusual or anything like that. I kept feeling unusual when we were eating. We would pray and then eat, but I kept feeling like I should say itadakimasu, like this phrase that we say before eating in Japan. And it kept feeling so weird not to say that. But Yuma never mentioned that he felt that kind of absence. Yeah. I think in our case, he has probably a much bigger connection with America, as well as, being a kind of first world, developed country here. He can watch videos from America. He can really connect with some of the culture, the media that America produces that way, and get a sense of what, these kids or these animated kids are like in America or other countries as compared with what he sees here in Japan. But that was actually one question that I was thinking of is, when you were in Niger, how easy was it to connect with your family and your support group in the US while you were there?
Yeah, that's because it is such a low developed country, but fortunately the internet was pretty available. And so we had weekly Skype or whatever we were doing at the time, FaceTime conversations with grandparents. But connections weren't, always great. They were oftentimes pretty broken up, but at least you do get some of that FaceTime. And we would take lots of DVDs, and so we would watch US movies, but streaming things was not an option, or just having access to, there was only one other US family in our city. And so we did have a weekly meeting with them as well, and that, helps. But so it has been pretty isolated, and the fact that they were homeschooled in our house, in some ways that helped us provide a little United States in our own house, but it's also not getting out and seeing what people are like, or what people even in the United States outside of our family are like. So that has contributed to it. Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any other aspects of your story that you think would be important to share before we close our time, Michael, or any other questions, Barney, that you'd like to ask before we close our time?
Yeah, if I understand that this might be kind of a big question. So I'm thinking again from my own experience of when I was getting ready to leave Thailand, and then since I have left, and thinking of what it might be like when I go back. And I wonder if maybe when you realized that you had to leave Niger and probably were uncertain of how and when you could be back again, were what were some of the things that you felt like? Did you feel like you had, especially like some kind of unfinished things that maybe you wished that you could get back and try and like tie those up, or make sure that they get, sent on, into the right hands, to make sure that they're, not necessarily to think in terms of progress, but that they're moving forward, that they're continuing if necessary?
Yeah, I think there were definitely some things on our minds like that. I was working with this community health evangelism program for training pastors, and so there's some sense of, well, is that continuing on? Where are the leaders that we raised up? Are they, following the training? And so that was a little bit of a worry, and it's still kind of up in the air. They're able to do some things, but also one of the things that's central to the training strategy is a realization that people have to make things their own. And so I had a little bit more peace in leaving that kind of training structure feeling like, well, we trained, we gave people tools. If they decide to take it in this direction that I thought things should go, that's great. But if not, basically what we were training them was to don't just go a direction because that's what somebody told you, but feel out what the problems are, what the resources are in your place, and follow, what God is doing in those things. So I've had a little bit more peace knowing, well, they aren't doing the same exact training structure, but some of the key leaders are still doing things that are about developing their communities and creating opportunities for sharing the gospel. And so I think it's going to serve them well, and hopefully they'll, find the best places to apply that. I think in leaving, the hardest thing for me was, after learning the culture and trying to build some deep relationships, with the idea of trying to keep it mutual and make people feel like we're really there for you, then to eventually say, well, we're not there anymore. We're going back. Now we're, you know, um, back into our own culture and those other ways of life. That's a little bit of a disappointment, a little bit of, I feel, part of me feels like, well, I didn't fulfill my sort of ideals of really being with these people and continuing to walk with them, because now I'm not with them. I'm walking a different path. So I think I have some guilt there and some unfinished feelings, but the idea of still being able to keep up relationship in Nigerian culture, visiting somebody is very important to the fact that they would make a point to visit their neighbors every day or every other day, just to show that we're here with you. And so the fact that I can still keep visiting, I think, helps to continue some of that in the direction that we always hoped it would be. So yeah, I think this first visit back that I had allowed me to have a little more closure of, yes, we are continuing on. But it's also very different when you come back as a visitor versus as somebody who has been embedded in the culture. And all the time you're a visitor, even when you're living there for years on end, but you're a different kind of visitor. And so that was a really interesting interplay on this visit, because in many ways they treated me like I was an embedded visitor, because I got to ride on the back of a motorcycle and eat their food, whereas other visitors from the US, they realize, okay, you can't eat this because your stomach isn't used to it. But so I had some of those experiences, but I also had experiences of not having a house to go to, not having a car and regular transportation, not having some of the normal staple things that were kind of my base and my comfort level, to just being, I'm a visitor traveling around and I'm going where you help me to go. And if I don't have a way to get there, I'm not going. And so some of those were kind of eye-opening to me, of how it feels to be a visitor and not have that kind of privileged place of an embedded visitor who knows what's going on, who has ways of doing things. Because even after a year, I'm a little bit out of touch. I don't have the same place and resources. So that opened my eyes to some things that I had taken for granted as a person living in a country. But I think it's also helpful in terms of the learner posture, the culture of humility, in realizing, oh, I took some of these positions of power for granted, and it's helpful to have some of that stripped away and really be able to listen again to what people are saying or what's different about the culture.
Well, I want to thank you, Michael, for being willing to come on as a guest for our podcast. I really find what you've shared to be inspiring. I feel like you've embodied that idea of a theology of companionship. It seems like you really entered in and cared about the relationships you formed there, and you still care. And I really like too the humility, like you were talking about there at the end, that you still hold with this whole experience, that you want to honor it and grow, continue to grow as you continue to process it. There's still more depth there. And so thank you for sharing that with us today. Were there any other details that we didn't touch on that you were hoping we would, or do you feel that we covered a lot of ground? And
nope, I'm appreciative for a chance to continue to process and listen to some of the interesting questions that you guys have as well. So thanks for doing this, and hopefully we can all keep growing in our cultural humility.
Absolutely. Yes. And thank you too, Barney, for your help with our conversation today. And we'll just turn it over to you now for our closing.
Yeah, we want to say thank you to everyone who is listening along today and watching on the video. We hope that this wonderful chance to sit down with Michael Ludwig has helped you maybe look about the way that we envision what a missionary or a co-mission partner, what their life is like, what they, how they're redefining this role, this important role, and kind of maybe why it is that some things have changed, what they do now as opposed to how things were done in the past. And we hope that just this general thinking, this general idea of how it is to interact between these two cultures, very, very easy to see in this case of Niger and Michigan, and maybe some of the culture, the subcultures, the little groups around you that you see, maybe how you interact with those in your everyday life. We hope that it's given you a chance to pause and think about that and reflect on that as well. And as always, we are very thankful for your continued listener and viewership. And we look forward to see you guys again. And for the Two World Podcast, I am Barney with Jacob and our special guest today, Michael Ludwig. Thank you very much.